The first thing Hope Callahan heard when the iron gates of the Wolfe estate closed behind her was a scream. Not hers. A man's sharp, furious, coming from somewhere deep inside the house, followed by the crash of something expensive against a wall. Then a woman in a housekeeper's uniform came sprinting down the marble steps, mascara streaking her face, a suitcase banging against her knees. "Don't," the woman gasped as she passed Hope on the drive. "Whatever they're paying you, don't. He's a monster. He'll break you." The taillights of her car were already vanishing down the tree-lined drive when Hope realized she was standing alone in the rain, holding a cheap umbrella that had already surrendered one of its ribs. In front of a mansion the size of a museum, she thought about Micah, 7 years old, asleep right now at her sister's apartment, his inhaler on the nightstand, the medical bills stacked on the counter like a second family none of them had asked for. She thought about the number on the contract in her folder. It had more zeros than any job she'd ever seen, and she understood exactly why. Hope wrestled the broken umbrella closed, squared her shoulders, and walked up the steps. The foyer was cold, not just in temperature, though it was that too, all black marble and glass, but cold in the way a place feels when no one in it has laughed in a very long time. A man in a dark suit met her at the door. He had the flat, watchful eyes of someone who had seen things Hope did not want described to her. "You're the new one," he said. It wasn't a question. "Silas, I run security here. Mr. Wolfe is in the East study." He looked her over, not unkindly. "The last 4 didn't make it past the first hour. One lasted 3 days, that was the record. He doesn't want a caretaker. He wants you gone before you cost him the trouble of learning your name." "Then I'll make sure he learns it," Hope said. Something moved in Silas's face and settled again. She couldn't tell whether it was respect or pity, and she would spend the next month learning it was both. He led her down a corridor hung with paintings and closed doors, and stopped before a set of double doors carved from black wood. From inside came the low murmur of a fire and, beneath it, a silence so heavy it had a texture. "One thing," Silas said, his hand on the door. "Don't ask about the chair, and don't look at him like he's in it." Then he opened the door and left her. The study was enormous and dim, lit only by a fireplace, and the grey stormlight bleeding through floor-to-ceiling windows. Books climbed the walls. A crystal decanter caught the firelight. And in the center of it all, turned toward the window with his back to her, sat a man in a wheelchair. "Get out," he said. His voice was low and even, almost gentle, which made it worse. It was the voice of a man who had stopped needing to raise it to be obeyed. "My name is Hope Callahan," she said. "I'm your new assistant. You're the 5th this month." He still hadn't turned. "You'll be the 5th to leave tonight. Save us both the theater and walk out now. I'll have the agency send your fee. Consider it payment for not wasting my time." "I don't want a fee for nothing," Hope said. "I want the job." Slowly, he turned the chair. She had seen photographs everyone had, before the Wolfe family scrubbed them from the internet. Damien Wolfe had been, in those pictures, the kind of beautiful that made rooms go quiet. He was still beautiful, in the ruined way of a cathedral after a fire. Dark hair going grey at the temples too early, a jaw like a blade, and his eyes pale, cold, grey as the storm behind him fixed on her with an intensity that would have sent anyone sensible straight back out the door. His gaze traveled down her, slow and deliberate and cruel, taking in her rain-damp coat, her sensible shoes, the soft fullness of her figure. "They sent me a housewife," he said. "You look like you should be baking someone's grandchildren cookies. Do you have the faintest idea whose house this is?" "I know exactly whose house this is, Mr. Wolfe," Hope said. "And I know what you are. Everyone in this city knows what you are." The corner of his mouth curled, and yet you walked in anyway. "Either you're stupid or you're desperate." "Desperate," she said simply. "I have a son. He's sick. This job pays for the medicine that keeps him breathing. So you can scream at me and throw things and call me a housewife, and I'll still be here in the morning because I've cleaned motel bathrooms at 4 a.m. And I've been screamed at by men a lot smaller than you, and none of it ever once put food on my table. But this does." She set her folder on the desk. "So I'm going to make you dinner now. You can eat it or not. I don't care. But I'm not leaving." For a long moment, Damien Wolfe said nothing. Then he picked up the crystal glass beside him and hurled it against the wall 6 inches from her head. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, whiskey running down the spines of his books. Hope didn't flinch. She looked at the broken glass, then back at him, and said, "I'll get a broom after I put the water on." She turned and walked out, and behind her, Damien Wolfe stared at the empty doorway, with an expression no one in that house had seen in a very long time. It looked almost like surprise. The war began in earnest the next morning, and it lasted 3 weeks. Damien had spent his entire life learning how to break people, and he applied that education to Hope with the focus of a man who had nothing else to do with his days. He rang the call bell at 3 a.m. and demanded tea, then let it go cold, untouched. He mocked her weight, her clothes, her accent, the calluses on her hands. He knocked a tray from her arms and told her to clean it up on her knees. He refused food, then complained he was starving. He described, in cold clinical detail, exactly how many men he had ruined, and watched her face for fear. Hope did not give it to him. She swept the food up. She made the tea again. When he mocked her weight, she said, "My son thinks I give the best hugs of anyone he knows. I'll take his review over yours." When he described the men he'd destroyed, she said, "That sounds exhausting. Scrambled or fried." She was, he discovered with mounting fury, unbreakable in a way he had never encountered, not because she was hard, but because she was the opposite of hard, all warmth and patience, and none of his weapons worked on softness. You cannot cut water. You cannot frighten someone who has already survived worse than you and looks at you not with fear but with something far more unbearable, kindness. But softness is not the same as blindness, and Hope watched. She watched, and she began to notice the small wrongnesses in the house of a broken man. She noticed that the study rug had a wear pattern near the window, that a wheelchair's tires didn't make 2 long scuffs close together, like the drag of heels. She noticed that Silas locked the East Wing gym every night and unlocked it before dawn, and that on the mornings after, Damien was paler, more savage, moving with the careful stillness of someone whose body ached in places a paralyzed man's body should not be able to ache. She noticed that once, passing the gym in the grey hour before sunrise, she heard from behind the locked door the low, rhythmic sound of a man breathing hard through pain, the sound of effort, and then the soft, deliberate thud of something being caught before it could fall. She stood in that dark corridor for a full minute, her heart doing something strange in her chest. Then she went and put the coffee on, and when Damien wheeled himself into the kitchen an hour later, drawn and wordless, she set the cup in front of him and said nothing at all. She said nothing the next morning either, or the morning after. She simply started leaving a second towel folded on the bench outside the gym door, and a bottle of water, and once a small dish of the arnica cream she used on Micah's bruises. She never mentioned them. They were always gone by the time she came back. It was, she understood without quite letting herself understand it, the most intimate conversation she had ever had with anyone, an entire language of things not said. On the 4th day of the 2nd week, she found out about the pain, the real pain, the kind he couldn't hide. She came into the study in the evening to find him gripping the arms of his chair, jaw locked, sweat standing on his forehead, in the grip of one of the spasms that seized his ruined body without warning. The previous assistants had learned to make themselves scarce during these episodes. Damien preferred to suffer when no one could see him reduced. Hope did not make herself scarce. She crossed the room, knelt beside the chair, and put her hands on his rigid calf firm, warm, sure, and began working the cramping muscle with the steady competence of a woman who had spent years soothing a sick child through the night. "Don't touch me," he snarled. "Breathe," she said. "In through your nose. Out slow. There you go." I said, "I heard you." Her hands didn't stop. "You can fire me tomorrow, tonight. Breathe." And he did. God help him. He did the spasm loosening under her hands, the pain ebbing, his breathing slowing to match the low murmur of her voice. For the first time in nearly a year, another human being was touching him, not to move him, not to treat him, not to pity him, but simply to help him hurt less. And Damien Wolfe, who had ordered men killed for less intimacy than this, could not make himself pull away. When it passed, she sat back on her heels and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and for one dangerous, unguarded moment, the ice in his grey eyes cracked, and she saw straight through to the drowning man underneath. Then he looked away. "Get out," he said, but there was no force left in it. She rose. At the door she paused. "It's all right to let someone help you," she said gently. "It doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human." "I stopped being human 11 months ago," he said, to the window. "No," Hope said. "You just decided to stop letting anyone see it." And she left him alone with the fire and the storm and the warmth still lingering where her hands had been. It was Silas who gave her the pieces, in the end, because Silas had been watching the boss eat. "He's cleaning his plate," he told her one night, catching her in the kitchen as she scraped a spotless dish. He said it the way another man might report a miracle. 3 weeks ago he was living on whiskey and spite. "I've worked for him 9 years, Miss Callahan. I watched him bury his father and take this whole city by the throat without blinking. I've never seen anything move him." He hesitated. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." "I'm not doing anything," Hope said. "I'm just cooking." "No." Silas leaned against the counter, and for the first time, the flat watchfulness in his eyes gave way to something older and more tired. "You want to understand him? I'll tell you one thing, and then I'll deny I ever said it." He lowered his voice. "The night he was shot, it wasn't a rival. It was at a family dinner. Inside this house, someone knew where he'd sit, which door we wouldn't cover, which minute the cameras looped. Someone with total access." He held her eyes. "Only one man alive had that access, and that man was the first to Damien's side when he fell, holding his head, screaming for the ambulance. Damien has never said the name out loud, not once, but he stopped trusting anyone that night. Everyone in this world is a knife to him now, waiting for him to open the door." Silas straightened. "You walked in and left the door open anyway. That's why he can't get rid of you. You terrify him worse than any gun." Hope stood very still, the dish forgotten in her hands, and thought about the scuffs on the rug and the locked gym and the towel that was always gone by morning. "Silas," she said carefully. "Who was the man? The one who was first to his side?" But Silas only shook his head, and would not say, and in the not saying she heard the shape of the answer anyway. "His brother." She brought Micah to the estate on a Sunday, 4 weeks in, because her sister was sick and there was no one else, and she was not going to lose this job over a childcare gap. She meant to keep him in the kitchen, quiet, out of the way. Children do not stay in kitchens. Damien was in the garden, one of the few places the estate's ramps let him reach, sitting alone in the cold sunlight when a small figure in a dinosaur sweatshirt marched up to him with the fearless directness only 7-year-olds and drunks possess. "Your chair has really good wheels," Micah announced. "Can it go fast?" Silas, watching from the doorway, went very still. He had seen his employer make grown men weep. He braced for what this small intruder was about to unleash. Damien looked down at the boy. "It can go fast," he said, after a moment. "How fast?" "Faster than you can run." "No way." "Get to the fountain and back before I catch you," Damien said, "and I'll give you $100. Micah ran. Damien caught him easily, wheeling across the flagstones with a speed that made the boy shriek with delight, and Silas, who knew exactly how fast that chair could move, and exactly how much of that speed came from arms a paralyzed man would have needed, filed the thought away and said nothing. Something happened in that cold garden that afternoon that Silas would later swear he had imagined. Damien Wolfe laughed, a short, rusty, disbelieving sound, like a door opening in a house long abandoned. Hope found them 20 minutes later, Micah perched on Damien's lap, the two of them racing down the garden path while the boy steered and hollered directions. She stopped in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. "He hasn't been out in the sun in months," Silas said quietly beside her. "Hasn't laughed since before the he stopped. Since before." That evening, after Micah fell asleep on the study couch under Damien's own coat, the two adults sat by the fire in a silence that had, somewhere in the last month, stopped being a battlefield and become something else. "He's a good boy," Damien said finally. "Where's his father?" "Gone. Before Micah was born, decided a sick kid was more than he signed up for." "He's a coward, then." "He's a stranger," Hope said. "That's kinder and truer." Damien studied her over the rim of his glass water, she noticed. Not whiskey. It had been water for a week now. "You could hate the whole world for the hand you've been dealt," he said. "The husband, the money, the boy's lungs. Any of it would justify it. Why don't you?" Hope watched the fire. "Because Micah's watching. Everything I feel about the world, He learns how to feel it too. If I teach him the world's cruel, he'll grow up braced for a fight. If I teach him it's mostly good, with hard parts, he'll grow up able to love it. She looked at Damien. You had someone teach you it was a war, didn't you? When you were small. The question landed somewhere very deep, and she saw it land. My father, Damien said, so quietly she barely heard him. He taught both his sons that the only safety is power, that love is a door you leave open for a knife. He set the glass down. He was right about one of us. Which one? But Damien only looked into the fire and did not answer, and Hope, who now knew far more than she let him see, let the silence stand. The truth of Damien Wolfe was this. He could feel his legs. It had come back slowly, in the 4th month a tingle, then an ache, then, one terrifying night, the twitch of a toe under the blanket. He had wept, alone, in the dark. And then, before dawn, he had made a decision that only a man raised to see love as a knife could make. He would tell no one, because the bullet that severed his spine had not come from a rival. It had been fired at a family dinner by a shooter who knew exactly where Damien would sit, which door the guards wouldn't cover, which minute the cameras looped. It had been an inside job so clean that only one person could have arranged it, someone who had sat across the table that night, and had been first to Damien's side when he fell, cradling his head and screaming for help with tears streaming down his face. His brother, Adrian. Damien had no proof. He had only certainty, cold and absolute. And so he had made himself into bait, a broken, dying man sinking into despair, waiting to name an heir because a wolf that believes its rival already dying grows careless. Eventually, Adrian would overreach, and when he did, Damien, who could stand, who could walk, who had spent 11 months in that chair building the patience of the grave, would be ready. That was the plan. Cold, perfect. The plan of a man with nothing left to lose. The plan had one flaw, and her name was Hope. Because a man with nothing to lose is untouchable, and somewhere between a whiskey glass shattered beside her head and a small boy laughing on his lap, Damien Wolfe had stopped being a man with nothing to lose. Adrian noticed before Damien did. He came on a Thursday, unannounced, the way a careful man confirms his investments in person. Hope was in the study arranging fresh flowers she'd started bringing them, small defiances of color against all that black marble, when Silas appeared in the doorway with his face carefully blank and said, Mr. Adrian Wolfe is here. Damien's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. Just once, then it relaxed. Show him in. Adrian Wolfe came into the room like sunlight into a cellar golden where Damien was grey, warm where Damien was cold, wearing an easy smile and a coat that cost more than Hope's car. He crossed to his brother and gripped his shoulder with every appearance of love. Brother, God, you look. He stopped, and his smile flickered, and something moved behind his eyes that Hope, watching from the corner with the flowers in her hands, caught and held. You look better, Adrian finished. You've got color. I haven't seen color on you since the accident. I've been sleeping, Damien said. Have you? Adrian's gaze drifted, slow and assessing, and landed on Hope. It traveled over her the way his brothers had that first night, but where Damien's had been cruel, Adrian's was something worse, calculating, cataloging. She felt herself being weighed as a threat and filed as a variable. And who's this? The help, Damien said. The help. Adrian smiled at her, all charm, and the charm did not reach his eyes at all. You've done wonders, sweetheart. My brother's practically glowing. It's almost like he's got something to live for again. He turned back to Damien, and his voice stayed light, and underneath the lightness was a blade. Just be careful. People who get too close to this family have a way of getting hurt. The help especially. His eyes flicked back to Hope, and to the small dinosaur backpack she'd forgotten by the couch. Is that a child's? You bring your kid here? To this house? He clicked his tongue softly. That's a dangerous place to keep something you love, Damien. Right out in the open where anyone could reach it. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Adrian, Damien's voice was very quiet. I'm only saying. His brother spread his hands, all innocence. It would break my heart if anything happened to them, truly. He crouched suddenly, bringing himself level with the wheelchair, and his voice dropped so low Hope almost couldn't hear it, but she had spent a month learning to read a room by its silences, and she heard. You've been sitting in this chair a long time, brother. 11 months. People are starting to ask when you'll name a successor. The organization needs a head that works, not a he glanced down at Damien's still legs and smiled, a decoration in a chair. Think about your legacy. Think about who's kept everything running while you've been indisposed. He straightened, brushed off his knees, and his voice went bright again. Get some rest. You've earned it. God knows you're not going anywhere. He kissed his brother on the top of the head, a benediction, a taunt, and swept out. The silence he left behind was absolute. Hope set the flowers down with hands that were not quite steady. Damien, she said, that man just threatened my son. I know. That man shot you. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out of her before she could stop it, and once it was out, it could not be taken back. That's the brother, isn't it? The one Silas won't name. The one who was first to your side. He did it, and you know he did it, and you've been sitting in that chair for 11 months letting him think. Damien's head came up sharply, and for the first time she saw real fear in his face, not for himself, for her. How much do you know? He said. Enough, Hope whispered. The gym, the rug, the way you catch yourself when you think no one's watching. Her voice shook. You can walk, can't you? For a long, long moment, Damien Wolfe looked at the woman standing in his study with flowers scattered across his desk and terror in her eyes, and he made the second impossible decision of his life. He told her the truth. He told her all of it, the returned feeling, the 11 months of performance, the certainty about Adrian, the trap he'd been so patiently building. He told her while the fire burned down and the storm came up against the windows and Silas stood guard at the door, and when he finished, Hope was quiet for a long time. You let the whole world think you were dying, she said at last. Your own people, for almost a year. Do you know what that costs? To be that alone on purpose? I thought it cost nothing, he said, and there was something raw and terrible in his face. I thought I had nothing left to spend. And then you walked into my house and refused to leave, and you brought that boy, and you started leaving towels outside a door you were never supposed to know about. His voice caught, and I stopped being able to do the math. A man planning to die can walk into any fire. I can't anymore. You did that. You made me want to live. And you have no idea how dangerous that is now, because Adrian saw it too. He saw the color in my face, and he did the same math I did, and he came here to tell me he knows I have something to lose again. He's not going to wait for me to die quietly anymore. He's going to make me watch him take it first. Take what? You, Damien said, and Micah. The storm threw itself against the glass. Somewhere upstairs, the boy slept. Hope crossed the room and knelt beside the chair, the way she had that first night with the spasm, and took his hand in both of hers, firm, warm, unafraid. Then we don't wait for him either, she said. They didn't have to wait long. Adrian moved 4 nights later. He came the way he'd come the first time, through a family that trusted him, with a shooter who knew the house, except this time the shooter's information was 11 months out of date, and the man he came to kill was not the man he thought. Hope was carrying tea down the dark corridor toward the study, Micah asleep upstairs in the room that had, without anyone quite deciding it, become his when she heard glass break. Not thrown this time, a window. Far side of the house. Then Silas's voice on the radio clipped to her belt, sharp and urgent. Breach, East Wing, get to the boss. She was already running. She hit the study door as the man in black came through the far window, silenced pistol rising toward the wheelchair by the fire, the wheelchair where Damien sat, exactly where a paralyzed man should sit, exactly where Adrian's information promised he would be helpless. And Hope Callahan, who had never in her life done anything more violent than swat a fly, did not think. She threw the tea tray. It caught the shooter across the face, scalding tea, heavy silver, and his shot went wide, splintering the mantle. In the half-second of chaos that brought, something impossible happened. Damien Wolfe stood up. He came out of the chair in a single fluid motion, crossed the room faster than the shooter could recover, and put the man on the ground with a brutal, practiced efficiency that had nothing broken in it at all. There was a short struggle, a wet sound, and a silence, and then Damien was standing over a body in the firelight, upright and whole and terrible, his chest heaving, blood on his knuckles. The empty wheelchair overturned behind him, and in the doorway, frozen, stood Micah. Mom, the boy whispered. He was staring at Damien. You were in the chair. You can't. His small face crumpled with confusion and the beginning of fear. Why were you pretending? Everything hung on the next moment. Damien Wolfe, who had ordered men killed without changing his expression, went to his knees in front of a 7-year-old slowly, so the boy could see him do it, so the boy would not be afraid, and looked him level in the eye. "Because there's a bad man," he said, "who hurt me a long time ago, and the only way to stop him from hurting the people his voice caught on it, the people I love, was to make him think I was still hurt. It's a secret, Micah. The most important secret there is. Can you keep it? Just a little longer?" Micah looked at him for a long, grave moment, the way children do when they're deciding whether an adult is worth believing. "Is Mom one of the people?" he asked. "The ones you love?" Damien didn't look at Hope. He kept his eyes on the boy. "Yes," he said. "Okay," Micah nodded, solemn as a judge. "Then I'll keep it." And he crossed the room and, with the total trust of a child who had decided, wrapped his arms around the neck of the most dangerous man in the city. "You should stand up more, though," he added into Damien's shoulder. "You're really good at it." Over the boy's head, Damien finally looked at Hope. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them had to. Adrian Wolfe came to the estate the next morning, wearing grief like a well-tailored coat, because his shooter had gone silent, and a careful man confirms his losses in person. He found his brother in the study, by the fire, in the wheelchair, pale, diminished, and Adrian noted with the private satisfaction he had nursed for 11 months, closer than ever to the grave. "Brother," he said warmly, crossing the room, "I heard there was an incident. My God, are you all right? When will these animals leave you in peace?" "Sit down, Adrian," Damien said. Adrian sat, but this time he sat the way a wolf sits light, alert, one hand resting easy near his jacket. He had not survived this family by being careless, and something in the room was wrong. The flowers were gone, Silas was standing too straight, and his brother's eyes, which for 11 months had held nothing but the dull exhaustion of the dying, were bright. "Do you remember," Damien said, "what our father taught us? That love is a door you leave open for a knife." He wheeled the chair a slow half-turn. "I believed him. For 41 years, I believed him. And then I got shot at my own dinner table by a man who knew exactly where I'd be, and I lay on that floor looking up at you crying over me, and I understood Father was right, but not about the world. About this family." Adrian's warm expression did not change, but his hand drifted an inch closer to his jacket. "Damien, whatever you think you know, I know you looped the cameras from the security office. I know you sent the guards on the east door to the wine cellar 4 minutes before. I know the shooter you sent last night is in a room downstairs, and I know he's already told Silas your name for a good deal less persuasion than I expected." Damien's voice never rose. "You should have made sure of me 11 months ago, brother. You should have put the second bullet in my head when you had the chance, instead of leaving me alive to grieve into your hands, because I've had 11 months to grieve, and I used every one of them getting ready for you." Adrian moved fast, faster than a grieving brother should be able to move, the gun clearing his jacket in one smooth, practiced arc, but Damien had been waiting 11 months for exactly that motion, and he was already out of the chair. He stood. He rose out of the wheelchair in front of his brother's eyes, and the sight of it, the dead man standing, the whole grieving fortress revealed in a single motion as a trap built with the patience of a corpse, cost Adrian the half-second that killed him. His shot went into the ceiling. Silas hit him from behind, and Damien's men filled the doorway. And Adrian Wolfe understood, one terrible heartbeat too late, that his brother had never been prey at all. That the wolf he thought he'd crippled had simply been lying still, watching, letting Adrian believe the hunt was already won. They pinned him to the floor. Adrian looked up at his brother standing over him, upright and whole, and for the first time in his golden, careless life, he was afraid. "How long?" he rasped. 7 months, Damien said. "I've been able to walk for 7 months. I sat in that chair and let you kiss my head and call me a decoration, and I waited, because I knew that a man who'd shoot his brother at a dinner table would never be able to resist coming back to finish it." He crouched down, the way his brother had crouched by his chair, and brought himself level. "You taught me patience, Adrian. That's the one gift you ever gave me. It took a woman with nothing and a sick little boy to teach me what patience was actually for." He straightened and nodded to Silas. "Take him. He'll answer for every man he killed to reach me. starting with the ones who died at that dinner so his story would hold. He turned away. Get him out of my house. They took Adrian out. He did not scream. Wolves rarely do. And Damien Wolfe stood alone in the firelight, upright in his own house at last, and found his hands were shaking not with rage this time, and not with pain, but with the vertigo of a man who has finally set down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. Then the study door opened, and a small voice said, "Whoa, you're standing again." And Micah came barreling across the room, and Damien caught him and swung him up, and over the boy's head, his eyes found Hope's in the doorway. He didn't say anything. She crossed the room and stood beside him, her son in his arms, the fire warm on all three of them, and for the first time in his life Damien Wolfe stood inside an open door and felt, coming through it, not a knife, just the light. They were married in the spring, in a small church with the doors thrown open to the morning, no black SUVs, no bodyguards along the aisle, though Silas stood at the back all the same, because some habits keep you alive. Damien walked to the altar on his own legs. He had done the physical therapy in secret for months and in the open for the last few weeks, and though there was a cane and a slight unevenness to his stride, he walked. And the whole church watched a man the city had buried in its imagination rise and cross a room toward a full-figured woman in a simple white dress who was not afraid of him and never had been. Micah carried the rings. He ran, of course. No one caught him. Damien didn't try. He just watched the boy go. And Hope watched Damien watch him and understood that somewhere in all of it he had become, quietly and without ceremony, a father. At the reception, in the garden where a small boy had once dared a broken man to race, Damien pulled Hope close and murmured against her hair the thing he'd needed a whole rebuilt life to earn the right to say. "I was a dead man when you found me," he said. "Not paralyzed. Dead, I'd decided. And you walked into my study with a folder and a broken umbrella and you refused to leave. And you dragged me back into the world one impossible day at a time. And you never once let me see how frightened you must have been." He drew back to look at her. "How were you never afraid of me, Hope? Every other soul in this city is." Hope reached up and touched his face, the way she'd touched his cramping leg on the fourth night, firm and warm and sure. "Because the first time you threw that glass at my head," she said, "you missed by 6 inches, and I knew right then, a man that dangerous doesn't miss by accident." She smiled the smile that had thawed 11 months of ice. "You weren't trying to hurt me, Damien. You were trying to make me leave, so you wouldn't have to feel anything when I did." She kissed him. "I just decided not to." Behind them, Micah shrieked with laughter, racing across the flagstones. And the man who had once believed love was only a door you left open for a knife stood in his garden in the spring sunlight, upright and alive and impossibly, undeservedly loved, and understood at last what his father had never known, that the door swings both ways, and that some people, the rare, unbreakable, soft-hearted ones, will walk through it carrying nothing but light and refuse, no matter how hard you try to frighten them off, to ever leave.